Hi, I'm Nicole Argo, the director of the TogetherUp Institute, and you are joining us on Reimagining Us.
Hi, I'm Scott Hutchison, Executive Director of E Pluribus Unum, and Nichole, who is our guest today.
We are thrilled to welcome Sam Pressler, the author of the Connective Tissue Framework. And Sam, ever since I learned about the framework, which is a set of strategies and policies that can help communities reconnect, re-engage, I've been chomping at the bit to have this discussion with you and Scott. We think that our listeners are going to be equally excited and inspired to learn what's happening in the sphere. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
So let's start with you. What would you like our listeners to know about you?
Yes, I could go in a lot of directions there. It's Taco Tuesday. So just very brief background on me. I kind of found myself in this work in many ways through my own process of discernment. I had this kind of crazy experience back when I was in college of accidentally starting what's now the largest community arts organization in the country for veterans and military families. And it was an incredibly powerful experience. It was also a very weird experience because I'm not a veteran. And I, prior to starting that, didn't really see myself as much of an artist. But I led that organization for 6 years. And through that work, there was just this kind of incredible, almost I would say sacred experience of community when you would see, people show up as strangers at the front end of a stand-up comedy class or a storytelling class or a writing class. And by the end of 7 or 8 weeks, they knew each other deeply and were willing to show up for each other well outside of the sphere of an arts class, visiting each other in the hospital, taking each other to doctor's appointments, giving people a place to stay if they needed it. And as I was growing that organization and then ultimately handing it off to a new executive director, I started ask myself, what the heck just happened? What was it that kind of kept me going in this work? And through just my own process of discernment, my own process of doing more academic research when I was doing a fellowship at Harvard, I kind of stumbled upon this aha question for me, which was how do we connect or how do we reconnect people to the communities, commitments, connections that make our lives worth living? And, what were we doing with veterans and military families? But, after leaving the military, you lose a sense of purpose and the sense of mission. You lose a sense of kind of identity as a soldier, a Marine, or a sailor. You lose a sense of camaraderie or community. And what we were doing was providing one outlet for a renewed sense of purpose, a renewed sense of community, and a renewed kind of sense of identity as an artist. And so I've been kind of following that thread since, and that's taken me in a few different directions. One of them has just been doing academic research around this and kind of connecting what was going on the ground to the bigger picture. Another bit of this has been writing kind of as I'm learning or learning out loud with this newsletter I write called Connective Tissue. And then the thing that I think we'll talk about a lot today is this connective tissue policy framework, kind of focusing on the role of policy in strengthening connection in communities. And I won't I can share a little bit of how that came about, but that's been this element of work. We're seeing a lot of people like the Surgeon General, people like Senator Chris Murphy, who were asking this renewed question around, hey, what can policy do to strengthen connection? What can policy do to strengthen social capital? But recognizing that that's a really complicated question because connection and social capital can mean kind of anything and everything. And trying to provide, through that work, trying to provide some more grounding to a kind of more organized and actionable approach.
That's so great. And as we talk more about it, I really want to go into, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Civic Live and things like that now, but I want to keep in mind the idea of, the role of policymakers and the role of government and how those interplay and how they translate, because I find that so interesting. But for the average person, why should the decline in civic life or the connection matter? How does it impact your day-to-day life, right? First, can you define what is civic life? What does that mean?
So I think of civic life and kind of associational life as all of the kind of intermediary groups and activities and institutions and organizations, and even like in some ways like the individuals who power those that sit in between, us as isolated individuals, the let's say our maybe our workplaces, and our families. It's kind of the place outside of work, family, and our kind of own solitude. And why does that matter? Well, it matters for lots of different reasons. I mean, we can point to the literature on, and this is well documented, and the role of our kind of connectedness and community for sense of health, and kind of being both a protector against adverse health outcomes and a promoter of positive health outcomes. We could talk about the role of connection and participation in the strength and commitment to like our local democracies and democracy as an institution. We could talk about the role of connection in just our own kind of measurable educational and economic outcomes, and how Raj Shetty's research around the greatest predictor of economic mobility in life is whether lower income people are connected to higher income people. We could talk about all of those things, but I actually think we should take a level deeper, right? Because I think that still distills things down into like really just like measurable outcomes, and I think life is more than measurable outcomes. And like my connection to others is the thing that makes my life worth living. Like that is the very thing I find meaning through working on shared projects with people in my community. I find purpose through building a family with someone or being in relationship with someone. I kind of realize the magic of what it means to be alive vis-a-vis my connections. And civic life is a key part of that. My connections in work can be a key part of that. My connections with my family can be a key part of that. My connections with nature can be a key part of that. But like, it's not, I'm in a little bit of pushback on like, this matters because it produces XYZ measurable outcome over ABC time period. Like this matters because this is essential to what it means to be a human being.
One of the lives we live work life, personal life, civic life's a life too. And maybe we don't pay enough attention to sometimes.
All right, you got me going. Okay.
Well, that's
Let's do
all right.
it.
That's why you're here.
I just have to say, I really love, I love that you're bringing meaning into this. You're bringing spirit into this. And I won't go as far as like talking about spiritual or things like that, but although I could, but I like what you're saying, like this human purpose, joy, right? Like, why are we here? To build and connect and be our whole true selves. And all of these things happens through relationship. And this is a point that hasn't come up in our conversations yet. And I thank you for that, because I do think, especially when we talk about policy and community, we always, what are educational outcomes and health outcomes and all this and that? It's important. But really, at the end of the day, when we lay our heads down on our pillows and we think about who we love and what we built and what mattered, it's those relationships. So thank you for bringing us back to that.
Yeah.
That's great.
And I also think, Nichole, it's important we spend a lot of time in this podcast talking about connecting across differences, right? And that's not what this necessarily is. And I mean, it doesn't just have to be that. It's really finding community and broadening how you participate, how you add to your life and lives plural. So I think that that's an important piece of it too, is that this is personal that you bring out. So I appreciate that as well.
Although I'm so curious, I would love to come back to that exact question at the end. To what extent because I agree, Scott, this is about connection and engagement and all these things. And really want to ask Sam his thoughts on this at the end of our episode. To what extent is connection across difference an important part of this? So we're going to just put it on the side and come back, because I think this is a core piece. Okay, so I want to just piggyback on what Scott said. Why is addressing community connection foundational to solving other big societal problems?
Sure, yeah. And so somewhat getting at that in the last answer, a lot of what seems to be coming about, if you're drawing on the academic literature, is like the thing beneath the thing with a lot of these problems is the breakdown of let's say the breakdown of civic life, the breakdown of kind of connection within our communities, right? And so like if we think about these health outcomes I'm speaking to, if we think about particularly deaths of despair, a core driver of deaths of despair is the isolation of people and the kind of breakdown and hollowing out of communities, particularly communities in Appalachia and the Rust Belt, where the kind of opioid epidemic started, right? So like that is a key driver there.
Quickly define deaths of despair for people.
Deaths of despair, deaths by opioid or drug overdoses, by suicide, and by alcohol-related illness. So that is just one point piece right there. If we look at recent conversations about democracy and democratic backsliding, I think I will push against the maybe the mainstream left narrative that if when people are more isolated, they support authoritarianism. I view it more as like when your institutions are kind of no longer working for you, including your democratic institutions in the community, and they're not reflective or representative of you, you don't see those institutions as worth supporting. And so, the kind of shift towards authoritarianism, supporting certain authoritarian people, both in the U.S. and abroad, is potentially a response that like local democratic institutions are not being responsive, and they've kind of broken down. And like, what is the kind of backbone of democracy? This is Putnam's work around making democracy work. It's local civic life. It's the civic groups. It's not even the like capital P political groups. There's also what Theda Skocpol talks about in Diminished Democracy. It's like these associational groups that are both about just community service and maybe have a political goal at end. Like the breakdown of that, when we lose our commitment and our habits of participation in that in our communities, we also we lose our practices and our habits and our support of these democratic institutions. So that's another one. Then we think about like economic pieces. And I'm a little skeptical of the economic mobility argument that Raj Chetty makes, because like, I think there's a case that economic mobility, kind of in the way that we've currently defined it, is adversely affects connection. I don't think a goal for communities should just be having the so-called best and brightest people leave the communities and that's what success is, because then that's breaking the bonds that they had with those communities. But like, we do know, and Putnam writes about this in Our Kids, like we do know that, your ability to succeed in school, your ability to get better jobs is driven through your networks. And I think there's a version of mobility where people have more access to networks and thereby continue to contribute to their communities and don't just leave for the big city or a different city. But like that is also driven by not just isolation, but the isolation of people without degrees, low-income people from higher-income people, and people with degrees. So it matters for so many of these different things that we kind of put our finger on as like core issues in American life. But underneath those, it's our relationships. Because again, and this is what's weird when you start talking about connection, like our relationships are everything, right? And the challenge and the mismatch right now is we've built a system that's about kind of like measurable, accountable outcomes, in some ways for good reason. But like we also, and I've done a lot of research myself on this, practical research in my past work, it is really hard to measure these things. And like we end up measuring away the things that become more important. And so I think there's got to be a move towards holding the need for accountability and measurement at times, with a recognition that like there needs to be different ways of thinking about measurement, or holding that like relationships, especially certain types of relationships and certain types of participation, are a good and an end in and of themselves.
On that point, Scott, can I diverge from our plan and ask a clarifying question?
Yeah, I love that. Let's go. Let's diverge.
So you were talking about how people's, becoming disheartened with democracy and leanings towards authoritarianism or democratic backsliding as something because these institutions aren't serving them, right? And Scott and I have often talked about this statistic. I can't remember if it was Pew or maybe PACE, a Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement, where they found like 14% of Americans reported that democracy was working for them, right? Which is such a low number. And so we've sat scratching our heads a little bit about this. But what I heard you say is the associational components of local life have traditionally been such a big and important part of democracy as well, of solving problems together and meeting needs, and even understanding what is a greater we, what are our collective problems and our shared interests. That today, where this conversation so often focuses on Congress and productivity at the national level, is it possible that we have something in our hands, that we have agency to increase the productivity and effectiveness of democracy, and we're just looking in the wrong places?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I did this policy framework, and I think folks who are really looking for big federal action are probably disappointed by it, because there are a few principles in it that I kind of lay out, and I could have probably laid it out more effectively so people saw them. But two of those principles are kind of a commitment to localism, right? Around the people closest to their problems, oftentimes are going to be better positioned for their solutions rather than kind of distant decisions. Because again, if agency is about distant corporate power making decisions in your life, distant government power making decisions in your life, or distant, frankly, nonprofit and philanthropic power making decisions for your life, part of the answer is to be moving things closer to people. So that's part one. The second is this kind of spectrum between what I call technocracy and kind of a more small d democracy, or kind of participatory approach. And it's not just moving things local, but it's making those local things more small d democratic and participatory. And so it's a shifting of our lens from, we're going to have experts in faraway places make the decisions that are right for people, to actually positioning decision-making governance within actual communities. So what does that actually look like in practice? I mean, I think all of local government can be made more participatory. That is at it. We shouldn't kid ourselves. That's potentially at the expense of efficiency. And there are going to be fights, particularly on the left, of the Ezra Kleins and Derek Thompsons of the world, who just want to build more housing, with maybe the more Danielle Allens of the world, who are thinking about more participatory democracy. And at times those could be in tension, at times those could be in alignment. But that is something that needs to be acknowledged. So opening things up to be more participatory, devolving more decision-making local. And I'm talking in generalities. Obviously, there are reasons why some things should be made national. But as a set of principles, I think that's where I start. And then government can start to see itself as a completely different thing than it is right now. Right now, a lot of local government is just, playing whack-a-mole with kind of fires, or kind of transactionally serving community members as clients rather than as kind of co-creators of that community. And so, one of the things that is in the policy framework, and I'm working on fleshing out more, is actually returning in some ways to what de Tocqueville saw when he was going through America, as the town or the township as not something apart from civic life, but as an extension of civic life. And so how can towns actually think about cultivating a sense of membership in their place, a sense of membership that Wendell Berry talks a lot about, right? Being a part of the place. And I think that looks at an entire life cycle of a community. So what does it mean to welcome people to a community? That point where you're at this great opportunity of building a new social network, but also a great peril of losing your social network. And how do you do things like providing welcome kits and activities fairs and welcoming activities to make, everyone who's coming new to the community feel welcome, but also people like veterans or formerly incarcerated people or immigrants who are having more acute welcoming experiences feel more welcome in their places. Local government can change their practices to do that. Then when you're in a community, what can you do to cultivate a sense of civic membership in that place? Well, you can do a lot of different stuff, right? You can fund really simple neighborhood activities like block parties with microgrants and neighborhood dinners and sports leagues, of violence interruption programs. You can, adjust your zoning to create more local communal third places, like micro pubs and micro cafes and little community gardens for people to gather. You can do an inventory of your entire public and civic spaces and make it online for people so they know where they can reserve, they know where they can go, and actually build something like colleges have, where you have a reservation system for civic spaces. You can do an entire census of civic life and like understand what are the groups in your community and put a directory up so people know who is there. So there's all these things you can do on membership. And then, by the way, you can like, when people leave your community, you could think of them as alumni who have left, and you can do things that like make people maintain their connection to the place they grew up or the place that maybe is special to them. And you can have homecomings. You can do like alumni groups for places. You can like build channels for alumni giving. Like these are all things that towns could do if they shifted their view from like kind of a transactional view of providing services to like an open, like a more open view of like co-creation of membership of participation.
That's an answer, man. Let me tell you. I have a lot of questions, a lot of things. Okay. Let's go back to economic mobility. First, I know what you were saying, about how it's used in the term, but we talk a lot about just saying, but everybody has the aspiration to do better. Mm-hmm. And when you have division and you have all of that, you have people, politicians, people whose stock and trade is to get you to vote for them, to get you to do something for them. Playing on that aspiration makes perfect sense. And so, because it's what you would do, right? And so going back to the civic life piece, what do you think the incentive is for policymakers to say, you know what? I heard Sam Pressler the other day, and I did read the framework, and I think that there's some good ideas in there. So I've got to get my whole body of government to start switching.
Yeah.
So what would you say the incentive is to do that?
Yeah, so I think there's, and I will name that I've never been an elected official, so I can't speak from my own experience. I have worked in policy behind the scenes before. I think there's, maybe I would answer this question in two ways. So like, let's say, I think, and honestly, I think the, Senator Chris Murphy actually represents both of these manifest at the same time. So I think the first, and the one that I just from my understanding of Senator Murphy and his team is like, he deeply thinks that something is wrong with our country, and it goes beyond anything that is, kind of typically viewed as a goal within what's been the neoliberal frame for the last 50 years of like economic growth, increasing life expectancy, those type of things. Like there was something deeper, and that came from both seeing, and this is speaking from what I've heard him say, seeing his kids grow up in this era of social media and technology, and seeing how sad and disconnected and his kids are. And it comes from, doing all of the work around Newtown and Sandy Hook, and recognize that no matter what, even if he was maximally successful on gun control, there was still a much deeper, what he calls a spiritual or metaphysical problem at the root of it, right? So that is the, like, if you want to get closer to solving the problem, that is the kind of first part. The second part is, I think, there's a political opening around it. Like there's political self-interest. I mean, the people who, at least from my experience, who are getting a lot of attention around this type of stuff, like post-election, Senator Murphy has been getting a ton of attention because he has been speaking to something deeper that is different from what the Democratic Party was speaking to. And he's getting a lot of, he's getting critical attention, but he's also getting a lot of positive attention around that. Governor Wes Moore in Maryland, like he's an exceptionally capable public communicator, and that's part of it. But like a thing he's gotten a ton of attention around has been his Department of Service and Civic Innovation. That's really been anchored around connecting people overall and across difference during this period of the adult transition. He's anchored his kind of political life around this thing, and he's committed resources to it. And so I think there's both the, hey, if you get into this because you really want to solve problems in people's lives, which I think a lot of politicians do. Like, I think most people are not cynical. Well, then there's that reason. And if you want to differentiate yourself and have an incentive to be doing something different, like I think there's a case to go in this direction. Now, zooming out 5 years, because this is harder to measure, because it's harder to kind of point to specific successes, like I worry that that's going to be a challenge here. It's like, as soon as like, you're like, what do you have to show for it? And there's not like XYZ measurable thing around economic growth, that could be a challenge. But like the aspirational side of me says, like, people who are really committed to this should still be thinking to do it.
We got 5 years to get that measure out there, But no, I think you're 100% right, though, and I really appreciate your idea of the hyper local focus. I agree, because that's what people feel. I mean, local politics was all about what people could see in front of their house or down their neighborhood, and you can't do that on a federal level. So I think you're so right about that. But I do believe there's a way to ask a question differently to folks about, instead of, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Really looking at your family, look around your neighborhood. There's a way to frame that in a way that I think we can build on over time, that reinforces the idea that connections, or even common shared aspirations, whether I connect with you as a person or not, my shared aspiration for my community is something that I share with you and can measure. So I really appreciate that.
I would also say, as someone who's done measures now for years, I don't have the same skepticism, right? We know the belonging barometer from the American Immigration Council and Over Zero, a team that I led, was able to show at a national level that average belonging for local level, national level, family, friends, et cetera, correlated with things like health and belief and support for democracy, engagement at the local level in a community. And we've seen other studies that belonging and connectedness, obviously there's a world of social capital literature that is impossible to really streamline, but that these things correlate with the black and white, harder outcomes that governments and cities and towns like to point to. But I also think that if you are asking people about how much they identify with their community, what they think it's going in the right direction, trust, the Edelman Trust Barometer and others, we can make a strong case. And even right now, agency and engagement in a community, these small D measures, all it takes is a community willing to track that over time, and they'd be able to see what's going well for which parts of our population, what isn't, how do we bridge these gaps,
Yeah. Could I just, to speak to that piece, I still see a role for measures. I think the thing that I'm aware of is how measures at times can be substitutes for trust. And so I think we need to be careful of kind of the mismatch between our methodologies and the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And like so just a very practical example with what I did before with the Armed Services Arts Partnership. I believe I'm one of the few community arts organizations that has created and led a randomized control trial on a community arts organization. And so, and I was very proud of that when I did it. And we had a waitlist trial, and then we had, so we had a control group, and we had a group of people who were going through our programs, and we did pre, post, 3, 6, and 12-month follow-ups. And that cost 30% of my budget for 6 years. And it was a huge tax on the time of our participants. And by the way, like we got significant sustained improvements in all these different domains of well-being. And all those things I could have told you 3 months into running that program.
Sure.
And so I'm glad that we did it. It's enabled the organization to get more funding, and in very practical terms, that's been good. But I think like people on the receiving end would say, like, why are you giving us all these surveys? Like, what happens in the classroom, right? Like, and so I think it's worth thinking about if our goals are connection, if our goals are agency, if our goals are trust, how are the methodologies we're using around measuring these things, maybe signaling that we don't trust, that maybe we don't connect. And that's not to say that we shouldn't have accountability, but that's saying like, what are the different ways that we can measure? What are the different ways that we can demonstrate that, particularly if we're using taxpayer dollars, that this stuff works? And how do we expand kind of the definition of that beyond what I did, which cost a lot of money, a lot of time, and I think was misaligned in some ways with what we were doing.
Sure. Or even it even might, I don't want to say it's an obstacle, but people don't like taking surveys when they could be connecting with someone next to them, or
Well,
there's a lot that goes into that. I would just say this though, there's an argument for, do we keep doing it 20 years in when people have been convinced, versus we're suggesting that communities alter the way that they have practiced associational life, or their North Star, how they're designing their meetings, their processes, et cetera. And whenever you are trying to persuade folks to change, you have to build a case, right? And I think I 100% agree with you. I also have a nonprofit with 40% of the budget has gone into measurement just so we can provide a gold standard case study. And it's hard. And it feels against the mission in some ways. It takes away from or detracts from attention and resources that could go into things that we know are working. But it also doesn't have to be forever. It just has to show people that it works, right?
Yeah. Well, this actually gets to, and if we're going off script, you can redirect me. But this goes to another thing that I think is tied to the conversation around localism, tied to the conversation around participation, and also tied to the past work that I referenced around Theta Scotchpole and diminished democracy, which is the governance, business, and kind of membership of traditional civic life has become fundamentally misaligned, right? So now what happens is we have, and I was someone running an organization like this. There's most organizations are like this. We typically have a nonprofit that has kind of the members or communities they serve over here on one side. And then we have our revenue sources over here from individual donors, from philanthropy, from corporations. And then because the business of our organization is to keep that going, we then oftentimes bring on board members who help us get access to those revenue sources. And so part of, if I running ASAP was not dependent upon philanthropy to fund all that I was doing in communities, I wouldn't have had to have gone to the level I did to kind of chase those dollars. Because ultimately that was told to me by the funders, like, we need to see proof of what you're doing so we can sustain it. And so I think, Nichole, just like going more upstream there, I'd say yes. And there's also a kind of concomitant shift within civic life where, like, how do we rediscover more alignment in revenue, in governance, and in membership? So, because that's a form of disconnection in and of itself within organizations. And then we have that disconnection within organizations in civic life. And instead of now me seeing myself as part of the broader ecosystem of which I'm a part, like I'm doing work with veterans, there's a housing organization here, there's a workforce organization over here, there's an arts organization over here. I'm viewing myself as a veteran stakeholder, and those are housing stakeholders over there. And so the funding streams build the silos within communities that actually make for less connection between groups within communities. And so just say that I'll say, it's a yes, and like obviously measures are important, and like can we accept things as they are right now? Sure, but then challenge what and imagine what they can be, so that that's less of a tension moving forward.
And I think I think you're 100% right. That has been, the funding structure. There's a lot of studies, a lot of reports on all of that. And I think you're seeing now a lot of heads of major philanthropy in this country are saying the exact same thing you're saying. It's like, we've got to start changing that, but it's hard to break it apart because it was built a very particular way. Yeah. And that goes back to, what I was talking about with government. It's like built the divisions that we see, my motivation as an elected official. I'm not an elected official. I'm acting like one right now. My motivation as an elected official is really to get the people I need to get me to 51%. So, my incentive, the way I build what it is I do serves that. And I think, what I hear you saying so much is if we can just look around us and really going back to the idea of aspiration, look at what we want, like what would make our community great, or what would I like to see more of? It really kind of, the redirection happens a little, it's never smooth when you're breaking apart something, but it's clearer. I think on a hyper local level, you can actually get to that, and which gets us back to the whole idea of connective tissue. the idea of finding those pieces that bring us together. You talked about social media and about, Senator Murphy, identifying, his children, how he sees the results of that. Do you also think things like social media, the things that we consume every day that are right in front of us, that is almost impossible to pull yourself away from all the time, can it help build that connectivity as well?
I think like technology is neutral in my view. It's a tool. It could be designed towards connection. It could be designed towards disconnection, right? Like it could be designed toward participation. It could be designed towards keeping people in our homes. I think there's a number of issues with how we go about technology, and particularly from both a policy perspective and a design perspective in this country. So something that, I'm going to refer to Wendell Berry a lot. Wendell Berry has said this, L.M. Sakassis says this, like we have in my opinion, a very warped view of how we approach our relationship to technology. We introduce technology first, and then we deal with the consequences after, once we introduce it. Like a potentially different approach is to ask a first principles question, which is, what will this technology do to the fabric of our communities? And then consider whether or not we want to introduce it. But that's not how it works in our current economic system. Like that's not how it's going to work, right? But I do think there could have been a set of questions on the front end before all these social media companies were introduced that would have maybe led to an imagining of some of the things that might have happened on the back end. And I know there was a lot of writing about that then. Second is a design question. Right now, and this go back to my comment around philanthropy, it does go back to like, where is the money and where is the decision making? The principle of design of social media and our like large tech ecosystem has been funded by venture capital, which wants a 10x plus outcome or bust. And so you're pushed towards things like efficiency, you're pushed towards things like scale, and like those things, and you're pushed to in things like user engagement, right? And so what is the other side of relationships are not efficient, right? Relationships do not scale. Like they take friction, they're messy, that trust has to build over time. So we built an entire like set of products that are disconnected from relationship. And so it shouldn't be surprising to us that like these things are tearing at the social fabric because the actual incentive structures are designed to do that. Second, and this goes to the engagement piece, right? And I wrote a little bit about this, like the entire business model of media since the introduction of television has been to capture as much of our leisure time as possible. The more time we are spending first in front of a TV, then in front of a computer, now in front of a phone or streaming or whatever, the more money that these companies make. Like that is a big part of the business model. What are we not doing if we're spending our time in front of those things? We're not spending time with our family, or we're spending less attentive time with our family. We're not spending time in community. We're not going to church or temple or mosque. Like it is the business model to keep us there and not with other people. And so there's a massive mismatch right now between the resources of tech companies and social media companies and the resources of my little community group that's trying to get you out. And I don't know, like to me, that is an area where policy can intervene, because it's if we value connection, that's a complete market failure. Like we've failed, like in the design of these systems, we failed humans in like the thing that matters most to us, which we said at the beginning of the conversation, which is like participation and connection. Those tools could be redesigned. Like I think one could imagine tools that like help people connect in community, that like specific goal is to get people to meet in person, that are not monetizing around time spent on them. But like next door is a neighborhood cesspool because it was designed to be that way. It was designed to promote outrage. It was designed to promote maximal engagement. It was designed to promote maximal growth. And it won. right? Like it won. It's a multi-billion-dollar company. There's an alternative in Vermont that gets a lot of attention in like our little circles called Front Porch Forum, which is designed to have friction. It's designed to make people have multiple interactions like online that show public displays of trust. And Nichole, to her point, like there have been studies that show that it actually increases trust and connection within communities. So there are alternatives. But the forces at play right now are not moving us in that direction. And I think like it's easy to talk about this stuff as like, great, we need to connect more. We need to do that. Like if we don't look underneath the hood and look at like the forces that are driving philanthropy, the forces that are driving the private sector, the forces that are driving government, like all we're doing is window dressing, right? Like it's just like we're just doing the like feel good nonsense. And this is maybe my more critical view, but like we're not actually getting at the root problem. And so I think a through line of my stuff is like I just am trying to get closer to like, okay, what's functionally happening? Like what is the how here that is creating all the weirdness that we're seeing around us?
Yes. So, and to exactly that goal, imagine I'm a municipal leader who sees my community needing connectivity and wants to move things towards there. Your framework has over 150 policy opportunities, which means I'm sitting there like, oh, what am I going to do? Like, how, knowing that there are these root causes, that they're structural, systemic, they're larger, what do I do? One thing I hear you say is start foundationally to question how everything that we're already doing impacts connectivity. What do I do first? How do I do it to start this transition? Like, where do I start?
I mean, it depends on the community, right? Like I think, we're talking, particularly when we're talking about local, there are so many different issues and so many different hot button topics. I'll say I've done this now policy framework rollout for the last 2 months. And my takeaway is for policymakers that if you really want to commit to doing this as a starting point, probably the best approach is to work within an existing issue area and then embed this focus on like connection or social capital or belonging within that issue area. So a very good, for instance, that I think will affect a lot of communities is housing, right? Right now, we have a housing crisis. It is framed exclusively around the material, around building supply, increasing affordability. That's important for sure. But housing is also like fundamentally affects who we interact with, the places we frequent, the groups we join, the people we build relationships with. And so for places that are kind of going through the process of trying to figure out how to make housing more affordable, how to build more housing, how to build more mixed income communities, think about how you can promote social capital or promote connection through that process. So on the front end, the design of how you're doing that process, in the actual like development process, like building in participation. And then on the back end, actually activating those communities and neighborhoods to promote participation and connection. So having microgrants for block parties, having microgrants for neighborhood dinners or neighbor circles, having like little microgrants for sports leagues, designing places like little kind of third places for people to interact and engage, like building that into the process. Because I think what could happen if we right now on this path is we actually may, if we're most successful, we build more mixed income communities, which, for some people that is a win, and we maybe make housing more affordable, but we do nothing to promote kind of cohesion on the back end. And that could actually lead towards backfire or just neutral. And it's just such an opportunity right now to kind of, to the point, like promote bridging social capital, whether it's across class, whether it's across race, age, all these different things. And it's not a part of the conversation at all. So like plug into what's already moving. For folks who are really inspired around this, like I do think you can make it an anchor of kind of your work in community, right? And so, you could build like, and I have a foundational changes section, like you could build a connection cabinet, which is like a reflection or representation of people from different departments within your government, community liaisons, community groups that are like doing the process of auditing what your government's doing, identifying opportunities, and then kind of working to build a plan that starts to embed this within government's actions. Like that is something that could be done. And you can go back to what I was sharing earlier. Like, you can view your town as a site of membership. Just like do these little practices that don't really cost that much money, potentially no money at all, to like make people feel more welcome, make people feel like more of a sense of a place when they're there. And then on the back end, make people stay connected even when they leave. Like, those are little things that towns used to do, that I think towns could learn much from, like, revisiting. And like, because the last thing I'll say is a theme I've been coming across a lot, and Nichole, you mentioned this earlier, and Scott, I have a sense that this is really important to you as well, is like, this stuff shouldn't be about eating your spinach, right? Like, it should be like there's so much of like the civic establishment is like, it's a sacred obligation. It's like, sure, like, yeah, it's really important. And it's also can be like really joyful. It can be really fun. It can be really weird. And like, you're competing with the NFL, you're competing with Netflix. That's just what Evan Weissman at Warm Cookies of the Revolution says. So like, you might as well make it fun and engaging and like entertaining, because the alternative is people are not going to come out. And so I maybe it'd stop there.
It's interesting that I agree with all of that. And is it like, if you wanted to give an example to somebody, like, let's say we get a group of policymakers in a room, city council people, county commissioners, and we wanted to hold something up. Is there a community or is there a program that, because you talk a lot about establishing a lens, which we totally believe too, because this is something that you can bring to every project, like you said, whether it's around healthcare, whether it's around housing, whether it's around education. Like, who would you point to and say, look, here's an example of a program that really takes this framework into consideration, whether they know it or not?
I may not be aware. I don't know of a place that kind of takes all of this into consideration. I mean, I have probably 50 or 60 case studies in the framework of different parts of this that are already in action, because I want to show that like all these different parts are already happening. Like, no one's fully combined them. So like, a good example, and this is not replicable to small communities necessarily, but like, Boston has an office of civic organizing, right? And it's a small team. It's 3 people. But like, what do? Like, their entire thing is to get people, neighbors in the street, interacting with each other. They have a block party grant that they've been able to host hundreds of block parties for like $30,000 a year, right? They have block cleanups. You have 4 or 5 block cleanups that are happening a week with kind of the block stuff that they're doing. So that's an example of like part of this membership piece we're talking about happening in Boston because Mayor Wu said like civic organizing and civic connection was a priority. And so that's like one small example. We have a fun example in Falls Church, Virginia. They read a newsletter I wrote around why every town should have a welcome kit. And this is a group that's connected to government, but outside of government. And they're just now creating welcome kits for everyone who's new to Fall Church. And they built out an entire program to give those out, right? Like, people are just taking action around it. There are towns throughout New England that do something called Old Home Week, which is basically a homecoming for people who have left to come back. And it's a full week of activities and fairs to foster that sense of civic connection for people who are in the place and for people who have left. And so there are like bits and pieces of this everywhere, to the extent that like a city or a place has like said, we're the city of, we like, our focus across policy is to strengthen connection in communities. I'm not aware. I'd love to hear if that's true. My sense is that we're in, to the extent that this is something that is adopted more broadly, like, we're in the very first inning of this, right? I mean, if I could just say, like, my historical view on this, I think we oftentimes like reference Putnam because Bowling Alone was such a big book, but like, Putnam is only talking about one part of history, which is like the decline of civic life in the mid 20th century. But like, before that, we had this era of kind of civic building in the late 19th century and early 20th century that like led to that crescendo. And that was a response to the industrialization and the decline of village and agrarian life that more organically promoted these connections, right? So we have industrialization that is then followed by this period of civic building. That period of civic building declines. Bowling Alone's written, and we're like, okay, social media technology is going to be this global village, this global connector. We're now in 2024, and like, I think most people are like, no, that's not what it is, right? So we're at the end. We're at the end of an era. We're at the end of a 50, 60-year period. And what we're going to build in the next 50 and 60-year period, the seeds are there, but those seeds have not like kind of sprouted into, I don't know where I'm going to take this metaphor, but into a garden or a forest, right? Like, and so I think we are at the very early stages, but the fact that we're asking these questions today and we weren't asking these questions 5 to 10 years ago, like this could be perceived as a fairly critical conversation. Like that to me is a source of hope. Like these questions are being asked, and like I think there's maybe not a collective recognition, but a broadening recognition that like we just can't keep doing things the way we've been doing. Because if we keep doing that, like I don't think many people are just making a case for like incrementalism on the same path that we've been on. And so that to me is like the sign of hope, but has that fully bloomed? Not necessarily.
So what I hear in that is a lot of people are recognizing we're ripe for change. And I'm thinking of our listeners, some of whom are going to be municipal leaders, but many of whom are just like everyday people living their lives who want to build these things in their communities. How can they advocate for these ideas within their local governments or with community leaders? And what role can they play just on their own without formal policy changes in their communities?
Yeah. I mean, it's so much of what I include in here can be policy change, but it's also can be outside of government. So that welcome kit example is a great example. I kind of position that as something that government can lead, but then like this is a community group in Falls Church that's doing it in partnership with government. And so I think, there's no reason that, if you want to make your community more welcoming, that you couldn't, work with your neighbors and local community groups to organize the welcome kit. There's no reason you couldn't work with neighbors and community groups to organize an activities fairs for newcomers and existing people. There's no reason that you couldn't organize an orientation for newcomers that's like hosted on an ongoing basis, right? If you're a neighbor, like you can throw a block party yourself. You can throw neighborhood dinners. You can both work with government and apart from government to do that. And Nichole, to your point earlier, like part of, getting people engaged, you can then make a point that it's worth the government, your local government investing in, like, hey, maybe $10,000 a year for a micro grant for block parties. You can do 50 block parties in a town of 50,000 people. That's pretty impressive. Wow. And so I think like there's so many of these little things that you can do. If you're in a community group or a civic group or you're looking to start one, I mean, I would really think about at the front end, what would it look like to build this group to create more alignment? Because I can guarantee you that the headache that you're going to run into most is going to be around this misalignment between your membership, your revenue, and your governance, like board and funding, and then complaints from your members or communities. Like those are the things that give people headaches. And so like actually by doing that, you're strengthening your local civic life. And then I think like there is a piece of, hey, like I want my community to like actually really anchor around connection as one of its goals. Like you can start to do that local organizing to build like a connection committee or a welcoming committee or whatever, do that outside of government and then like make the pitch for government that this is something and you can do that work. And I think there's going to be a question about ROI, right? But I think you can start by saying there's a lot of simple things that we can do that don't require huge investments that can be done for free. And so I think like that is another piece. And then I'll say the final thing, and we didn't talk as much about this, but I think it's really worth noting. These conversations could really start to feel like, middle class and upper middle class people talking about how to be more connected. And if you look at like the data from a big study I published with Dan Cox of the Survey Center on American Life, like the fundamental divide in civic life is a divide of education and whether or not you have a college degree. And so I know there's an element of this around bridging. Like I think figuring out how you can build more avenues for cross-class connection and cross-class solidarity within your communities like is really, really essential, because more CrossFit classes that cost $200 a month, more improv classes that cost $400 a month, like all of these things that are pay to play, like vis-a-vis both where they're located, like the geographies they're located, and the kind of price tag on it, make it extraordinarily difficult for people to participate if they don't have financial resources, free time, things like that. And so how do you build and how do you create more spaces for this connection across class? that strikes me as like a vitally important question in the next 50 years of this work.
That's so beautiful. You came right back to that question we put aside until the end. We'll tied this up with a bow. I was refraining because I know we're over time. But Scott, did you want to ask a follow-on?
No, just as the oldest person on this podcast, I have to say, for people who are listening, I do remember the welcome wagons.
Yes.
When it's like, let's not forget, we used to do that. People used to do that. And they came through churches, civic organizations. When you moved into a community, there were people knocking on your door telling you where the schools were, where the grocery stores were, where the library was, where a swimming pool was. It was something that happened all the time. And, as somebody who moved a lot, I remember it very, very clearly. But this has been a great conversation, Sam. Thank you so much for being with us today. And there's a lot to this and a lot of hope in it, which I hope people hear, and a lot of opportunity in it too. So I think there's a lot going on, and I think we've got a lot to learn from it. So thank you so much, and thank you for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Reimagining Us is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Please follow the show and give it a 5-star review if you'd be so kind. Learn more at nextchapterpodcast.com/reimaginingus and togetherup.org/reimaginingus.